Chapter 19. Total darkness surrounded Holly. As if awakening from a trance, Holly blinked and lowered her hand. She looked around and could see nothing. She could hear nothing either. Where was she? What had happened? Holly stood motionless, trying to figure things out. Slowly, bits and pieces came to mind. There was the nightmare school, Headmaster Snape, and the silver heart. Holly hadn't meant to touch the heart. It was as if she couldn't stop herself. Vaguely, she remembered hearing Headmaster Snape wish her good luck. What had he meant? Had he known this would happen? What had happened? Gradually, Holly became aware that she was not alone. Despite the darkness and silence, she could sense someone else, someone exhausted and very, very sad. Holly could feel the tears stream down her face, but she didn't know why. She brought her hand up to brush away the tears and realized she was still holding Lily's wand. "Lumos," Holly whispered, waving the wand. Nothing happened. Holly tried again. "Lumos." Nothing happened. Giving up, Holly stowed Lily's wand in her pocket. Then she stretched both hands out into the darkness and cautiously moved towards the source of the emotion. It seemed familiar somehow. "Hello?" Holly called out while groping in the dark. A low voice answered. "He's dead," the voice moaned. "I killed him." Holly knew that voice. "Albus? Is that you? Are you here?" She took some more halting steps towards the sound while feeling around with her arms. "It's me, Holly." "He's dead," the voice repeated sadly, ignoring her. "And it's all my fault." The voice trembled with emotion. "Who's dead?" asked Holly, fearing she already knew the answer. She continued to take tiny, halting steps towards the sound. If she could keep him talking, maybe she could find him. The voice sounded much closer now. "Dad," came the reply. "I couldn't help it. I couldn't stop it. It's all my fault. He's dead, and I did it." The grief was overwhelming. Holly couldn't stop herself from crying, but she still tried to move forward. The voice seemed so close. Suddenly, she bumped into something. About to fall, Holly's hands flew out forward to steady herself, and they touched something soft. "Albus, is that you?" Immediately, the voice started screaming, "Get away from me! Get away from me! Don't touch the chair!" That intense sorrow instantly turned into terror. Impelled by an emotional instinct not her own, Holly scrambled to back away, but she couldn't see what she was doing. In pushing away, her hands touched something hard and firm. Immediately, Holly felt herself being sucked forward by a grasp so strong she couldn't resist. The thick, cold bands wrapped themselves around Holly's arms and chest, slamming her into the base of the chair and pulling her up and forward. All the while, the voice kept on screaming, "Get away! Get away!" Frantically, Holly tried to pull away. Suddenly, her arms stopped moving up. The bands still tugged, but they had snagged on something. Holly reached with her fingers, grabbing for anything. She felt other fingers, a hand. Twisting her arm, she managed to unwrap the bands of one of her hands. She felt the band twist and turn, trying to wrap itself around her again, but it finally latched onto the other wrist and other hand. Using her free hand, Holly unwrapped the other band, guiding it by feel to the other wrist. The band immediately latched on. Using both hands, Holly reached for the band that pulled her body up. She tugged and unwound it as best she could, finally breaking free of its grasp. Holly slid to the floor. In panic, she scrambled quickly away from the chair, away from Albus. She sat in the darkness, panting. The voice quit screaming. "Albus," began Holly, "what's going—" Abruptly, the lights came on. Holly could see again. She was sitting on a stone floor in a small, four-sided room with walls of stone. Flickering torches mounted up high on the walls cast eerie shadows throughout the room. Holly could see no doors or windows. What drew Holly's attention most was the massive chair in front of her. It was made of plain, heavy, dark wood. Huge straps attached to the chair wrapped tightly around a tear-streaked Albus. He was bound so tightly that he could scarce move his fingers. Each arm was securely held down to an armrest. His chest and upper body was pinned to the back of the chair. His legs were bound to the chair base, preventing any movement. The ends of the straps curled and uncurled, floating in the air, as if seeking something else to latch onto. "Albus!" exclaimed Holly, getting up. "Keep away," warned Albus in a hoarse voice. "Don't touch me." Holly froze in place. "I don't understand," began Holly, puzzled. But Albus didn't look at Holly. His eyes were glued to a fixed point just beyond Holly. Holly turned around and looked. Behind her was a huge standing mirror. She could see both hers and Albus's reflection in it. As she watched, a shadowy mist began to appear in front of the mirror. The mist grew thicker and thicker until it began to take shape and form. "It's happening again," croaked Albus eagerly. "Maybe we have a chance." "What do you mean?" Holly began. Then her voice trailed away. Her blood chilled. The misty form had grown firmer and more distinct. It became the figure of a proud, pale young man with black hair and cold, dark eyes. She had seen him once before in a painting, jubilantly casting his curse, killing Headmaster Dumbledore over and over again. Tom Riddle fixed his eyes straight at the chair holding Albus. "Hello, Harry Potter," he said coldly. "Surprised to see me?" Tom Riddle smiled at Albus and continued speaking triumphantly. "It was little Ginny's idea, actually. She was so sure you were absolutely the greatest wizard ever born that we cooked up this surprise for you on the off chance her assessment of you was more than the ravings of a love-sick little girl." "Ginny?" spoke out Holly, confused. "Hush!" commanded Albus urgently, his eyes glued to the figure. "I didn't hear this last time." "Wondered how I got you here," continued Riddle, oblivious of the words spoken between Holly and Albus. Holly returned her attention to the figure. It must be a recording of some kind, or he would have surely noticed that it was not Harry Potter who sat in the chair. "Little Ginny kept on and on about your beautiful green eyes. She said no one at school had eyes as green as yours," he continued. "She even told me how her brother got detention in the trophy room. So we set this little trap in the trophy room where someone serving detention would surely be here to see it. If you managed to survive, I knew you would be sure to get another detention. Our little trap only affects people like you, with green eyes. But I knew love-sick little Ginny had only eyes for you. She probably didn't see anyone else's eyes, let alone their color. So I had her fetch some of your hair to add to the spell. That way, only a Potter could activate it. And here you are." Tom Riddle straightened and took a step back. "You may wonder why I brought you here, Harry," spoke Riddle calmly as he paced back and forth. Holly cautiously stretched an arm forward. Her hand sliced through the figure as if it wasn't there. "Don't!" hissed Albus to Holly while still watching Riddle. Holly moved to one side of the chair to avoid being run through by the figure. Riddle stopped abruptly and fixed his gaze again on the chair at Albus. "You and I are about to have a rematch." He returned to pacing back and forth like a professor giving a lecture. "While you sit here, time is moving backwards, back to before our little encounter. We're going to relive those events, you and me. Except this time," he stopped and fixed his eyes again at Albus, "I can assure you the outcome will be very different." Riddle resumed his pacing. "I can't imagine," he continued, "how you could ever manage to walk out of the chamber alive, let alone defeat me. But you couldn't have done it alone. You had to have help. You'll still have that help. One mustn't meddle with time too much. But that help will arrive to you here, in this room, instead of there, with your other self." Tom Riddle smiled coldly. "Feel free to use that help, whatever it may be, to help yourself, if you can." The ends of the straps binding Albus twisted in the air, curling and uncurling more quickly, as if emphasizing Albus's inability to move. It seems unfair of me to expect you to fight your last battle without at least watching it happen, the figure said, and gestured behind him to the large mirror. Its polished surface began to swirl with color as he spoke. You will have the unique experience of being able to watch yourself die. The image of Tom Riddle laughed. That high, cold laugh gave Holly the shivers. He again leaned forward and looked towards Albus with his piercing black eyes. I just don't know what will happen to you here when you die. Riddle pointed back at the mirror. There. Will you die as well, or will you spend the rest of your days in this room alone and starve to death? Tom Riddle straightened up. Either way, he concluded softly, coldly, it will be goodbye to the famous, he spoke very slowly, emphasizing each word, Harry Potter. Then the figure dissolved into mist and vanished, leaving Albus and Holly alone in the room. Albus, began Holly, moving towards him. Keep away, Albus commanded urgently. Holly froze in place. These straps keep tightening when I move, he explained further. I don't want you to risk being caught by them. I think that's Mum there on the floor, he continued, directing Holly's attention to the mirror. Holly turned to look at the mirror. It showed an overview of what appeared to be a large cavern. The scene looked down over the head of a huge stone statue. Between the feet at the base of the statue were 3 people in wizard robes. One, a girl with bright red hair, lay still on the ground. Ginny Potter? That's Dad bending over her, continued Albus. Holly recognized a very much younger version of Cousin Harry. And the third person leaning over on that pillar is, I don't know. Tom Riddle, finished Holly in a whisper. She recognized him from the painting. The third person on the heart, agreed Albus thoughtfully. That makes sense. The two watched the mirror silently. The boy that was Cousin Harry tried to lift Ginny off the floor. Tom Riddle just watched. Then Cousin Harry lowered Ginny. He stood and faced Riddle. The two were talking, but Holly couldn't hear any words. Tom Riddle pulled out his wand and waved it in the air. What's he doing? Asked Albus. It's too far away for me to tell. Holly peered up close to the mirror. It looks like writing or something, she decided aloud. The letters seem to move about and then stop again. There's an I and an O, she continued aloud. They're gone now, Holly concluded lamely, implying she couldn't read them. But that wasn't quite true. Once Holly realized the tiny letters appeared backwards, it had been fairly easy to guess their meaning. It just hadn't made any sense. Lord Voldemort? How could Tom Riddle also be Lord Voldemort? Holly vividly remembered the painting where Tom Riddle and Lord Voldemort both cast their killing curses. How could there be 2 Lord Voldemorts? With a sudden start, Holly realized that she had been dealing with 2 of everything all day. Tom Riddle had expected there to be 2 Harry Potters. Why not 2 Lord Voldemorts? Holly shook her head in confusion and shoved her thoughts aside as a bright red bird with a golden tail flew into the cavern. It dropped something at Cousin Harry's feet and landed on his shoulder. A phoenix, Albus was saying. Dad told me Dumbledore had one. The 2 in the mirror stood and talked to each other. Dad looks so young, doesn't he? Commented Albus. 2nd year, breathed Holly, remembering. Huh? How did you know? Asked Albus. Headmaster Snape told me, she replied. Snape? He's dead. I know, whispered Holly sadly. Suddenly, Tom Riddle walked off. He came to a stop between the high pillars and looked up. Harry backed up, hitting the chamber wall. Something came down from the head of the statue and hit the floor. It looked like a huge, thick, green snake. What's that? Asked Holly. She watched as Cousin Harry began to run, his arms outstretched. I think that's a basilisk, replied Albus. If you look into its eyes, you die. Dad must have his eyes closed. Cousin Harry suddenly tripped and fell. The phoenix flew in and attacked the snake's head, darting in and out with its sharp beak and claws. I never heard about any of this, complained Albus anxiously, watching the snake thrash around. I don't know what's supposed to happen. There, he said urgently. That's his help. Holly looked around and saw a silver sword glistening on the floor. Its handle glittered with bright red rubies. You've got to get it to him. How? I don't know, but if you don't do it, Dad's dead. We're all dead. Holly lifted the heavy sword. Where to put it? She could only see Cousin Harry in the mirror, so she swung the sword against the mirror, aiming it at him. It landed on the smooth surface with a loud clunk. "Hurry!" cried Albus desperately. Holly tried again. Using the point of the sword, she jabbed the sword again and again at the mirror, mostly at and about Cousin Harry, trying to find a way in. Suddenly, Holly felt the sword give a bit, instead of bouncing off. She pushed the sword in further and further. The point had connected with the sorting hat Cousin Harry now wore on his head. With a final thrust, the sword slid up to the hilt into the mirror. Holly released her grip and pushed the sword the rest of the way into the mirror. Panting, she stepped back. They watched as Harry Potter grabbed the sword from out of the sorting hat. The snake lunged at Cousin Harry. Still clinging to the sword, he dodged, and the snake hit the chamber wall. The snake, its mouth opened wide, lunged at Cousin Harry again. He brought the sword up into the roof of the snake's mouth. The snake keeled over sideways and fell, still twitching to the floor. The room went black. Albus and Holly were again in darkness. "What now?" wondered Holly out loud, breaking the silence between them. "I don't know," replied Albus in the darkness. "Last time the basilisk opened his mouth wide like that, and it bit down. It sank its teeth into Dad's chest." Albus's voice trembled. "And it lifted his head up with Dad's in his mouth, and it kind of shook Dad around, and I felt all sort of empty inside." Then the room went dark like this. Except I knew Dad was dead, and that I had killed him by being here. "Well, he's not dead now," assured Holly. "You didn't kill him." Suddenly, the lights came on. Both Holly and Albus looked over at the mirror. Its polished surface again began to swirl with color. The color solidified into a new scene. This scene showed someplace outside in the open air. Everything looked almost gray. It could be dusk or dawn. In the gloom, Holly could make out a big castle and a huge door of some sort. "Isn't that Hogwarts?" asked Albus. Holly peered closely. "I think so," she agreed, recognizing the familiar gate. Both the walls of the castle and the door looked heavily battered. She could see black scorch marks everywhere, and some sections had crumbled, leaving pock-marked indentations. "What are those lights on the other side in the forest?" questioned Albus, drawing Holly's attention to tiny pin-pricks of light moving in a line towards the wall. She looked closely. "Those are wands," she announced. "It's a procession of some sort." They watched as the lights drew closer to the wall. They winked out when they reached the forest edge. Holly could see some shapes start across the huge grounds of Hogwarts. Leading the procession was an imposing figure with a huge snake wrapped around his shoulders. He came to a stop in front of the school entrance. "Voldemort," whispered Holly fearfully, recognizing that white skin and proud bearing. "That's Hagrid," exclaimed Albus, as the second person in the procession came into view. "What's he carrying?" Others followed and gathered in a crowd behind Hagrid and Lord Voldemort. Albus and Holly watched as the doors of Hogwarts opened, and the reddish glow of the light within streamed out, illuminating the figure in Hagrid's arms. "Dad!" exclaimed Albus, answering his own question. "He looks dead. He can't be dead!" His voice rose in panic. "What happened?" "No," assured Holly firmly, hoping desperately she was right. "He can't be dead. We wouldn't be watching it if he were dead. It must be a trick of some sort." They watched as people from within filed out and onto the front steps and looked onto the figure in Hagrid's arms. Lord Voldemort stood in front to one side, stroking the head of his snake. Hagrid lowered Cousin Harry's still form onto the grass. The people from the castle surged forth, only to stop after a flash of light from Lord Voldemort's wand. Lord Voldemort seemed to be talking to the crowd. Abruptly, someone broke through the crowd and raced forward towards Lord Voldemort. Lord Voldemort pointed his wand at the person, and the figure fell to the ground. "That's Professor Longbottom!" cried Albus in surprise, recognizing him after he stood up shakily and faced Lord Voldemort. The hands of the person who would become Professor Longbottom curled in a fist and looked defiant. They stood facing each other. Then Voldemort waved his wand. A ragged piece of dark material floated out of the castle, landing in Voldemort's hand. Then Lord Voldemort pointed the wand at Professor Longbottom. He stiffened and stood helplessly, while Lord Voldemort placed the cloth, which turned out to be the old sorting hat, onto Professor Longbottom's head. Albus and Holly watched in horror as the hat burst into flames. "There!" cried out Albus suddenly. "The sword! It's the help! Get the sword! Hurry!" Holly looked around and again saw the red jeweled sword lying on the ground at Albus's feet. She lifted the sword and aimed it at the mirror. "Get it to Dad!" shouted Albus frantically. "Hurry!" "No," corrected Holly, lifting the sword to point at a place in the mirror that was higher than the still form of Harry Potter. "He's not supposed to get it," Holly said, remembering the painting across from the Defense Against the Dark Arts room. It had been Professor Longbottom carrying the sword, not Harry Potter. She aimed the point at the burning sorting hat. The tip slid easily through. Holly kept pushing the sword in with all her might until the handle vanished within the depths of the mirror. The two of them, Albus and Holly, glued their eyes to the burning sorting hat, wondering what would happen next. Suddenly Professor Longbottom moved, and the burning hat fell off him. He reached down to the hat. Using both hands, the professor drew from within its depths something silver with a glittering rubied handle. Then Professor Longbottom lifted the sword high and, with a single stroke, sliced off the head of the huge green snake still sitting on Lord Voldemort's shoulders. The snake's head spun high into the air, flying straight at the mirror. Its spinning shape grew larger and larger in the mirror as it drew near. Then the head seemed to strike the mirror's surface, and the mirror exploded. Shards of glass and chunks of mirror frame flew straight across the room. Holly turned and ducked down, trying to shield her body. Then Holly felt something hit her head, and everything went black.